Ukraine is one of these rare conflicts, and it's not always the case, and there are plenty of examples on the other side of this, where it is quite clear who is the perpetrator and who is the victim, who is right and who is wrong. I mean, not to reduce things to too simplistic a level, but it is actually pretty straightforward in this case. Russia invaded sovereign Ukrainian territory because they felt like they could, and they felt like they would get away with it, and felt like they would be able to take part of Ukraine or all of Ukraine at a manageable cost for them. We have built a system in the world that is designed basically to stand against all of that, that is designed to stand against the principle that might makes right, and that strong countries can just do to weaker countries what they want. And so this, for us, when we learned several months actually before Russia went in full scale that this was going to happen, was a pretty straightforward case for us in terms of which side of the conflict we would be on, certainly. I mean, Ukraine had been a partner of the U.S., and leaving aside who is our friend and who is our adversary, just who was right or wrong in this dispute. And for much of the rest of the world, I think they saw it the way we did, not the entire world. And, we can talk more about why countries may or may not always see it that way. What is baffling, I think, to many of us is not necessarily that President Trump wants to end the war. By the way, I think no matter who got elected president in November, there was a very high likelihood that there would be negotiations aimed at trying to end the war during the course of this year, of 2025. We were talking to President Zelensky about that at the end of the Biden administration. I think all expectations were that there would be this negotiation this year. What is more surprising, and I think really I cannot explain it, is why we have an administration now, or at least a president right now, who seems to believe that Ukraine is the party in the wrong. He'll talk sometimes about how Ukraine started the war, how Ukraine is the party that is reluctant to make peace. He seems to be using the weight of the United States not to build up Ukraine so that it can achieve fair and just terms in an eventual settlement, which was our approach. We didn't provide security assistance to Ukraine so they could fight a war forever. We provided them assistance so that they could, one, try to take back as much of their territory as they could, but two, if they decided to negotiate, be in a strong position to do that so they could get terms that they decided were just. He seems to be doing this the other way around, starting with what Russia believes it needs in an eventual settlement, and then trying to put pressure on Ukraine to deliver for Russia what it needs. And I do not understand that strategy.
And can you help contextualize for listeners, $75 billion roughly of aid, is that correct?
More, I think.
Okay. Is that in kind, so to speak? Like if you give weapons to them, does that count in that price tag? And where exactly was the money going? Because I think that's part of the struggle, is that for President Trump, he can scream and yell about how much it was, and without people really understanding where that money was going, I think it's hard for people to understand the tangibility of that.
So I think there's a few things that are important to keep in mind here. One, for every dollar the United States has spent to defend Ukraine and help Ukraine defend itself, the countries of Europe have put in even more in terms of economic assistance to Ukraine. It's often portrayed here as if the United States has taken on the entire burden of this conflict. It's actually dollar for dollar. The Europeans have put more money into supporting and defending Ukraine. The United States has done more in terms of security assistance. The Ukrainians have done more in terms of economic assistance. But also, where does U.S. security assistance, where do those dollars actually go? Many of those dollars, in fact, the vast majority of those dollars are actually spent building out our own defense industrial base. In other words, building out our capacity to produce munitions and weapons that are then provided to Ukraine. So, for example, we identified very early on that Ukraine was going to need more things like artillery shells and more things like air defense interceptors to stop Russian air attacks and missile attacks on Ukraine. We build those things, but we weren't building enough of them. So the dollars that we provided through the supplemental appropriations to support Ukraine were actually spent in many cases on U.S. manufacturing capacity. Yeah. Pennsylvania and other places. Texas, I think, is another one where these things are built to build out the production lines, create jobs here, by the way, and improve our own economy. Not the reason we did it, but it's certainly an ancillary benefit, and then provide these capabilities to Ukraine because we did not have enough capacity to help them to the extent we needed to.
So can you talk about the implications of what the president is suggesting and your reaction to the Oval Office meeting. I think a lot of people still are having trouble understanding what it would mean for the United States if we were to back off aid to Ukraine and if Putin would be successful.
Yeah. So look, again, I want to start by saying I think the instinct to try to and want to end the war is a good one. Okay, that President Trump has. That, by the way, President Biden had. That we wanted to end this war as well. So long as that ending is just, and so long as that ending is durable. And again, the concern about the current administration's approach is it won't lead to an ending that is just. It'll be on Russia's terms, not Ukraine's, and therefore probably won't ultimately end up in an agreement because Ukraine can't accept that. But second, it wouldn't lead to an ending that's durable, because if the war ends and there are no guarantees for Ukraine that Russia can't just resume the war 2 years down the road, that is most likely what will happen. Russia will pause, they will rearm, refit, rest their forces, and then go right back to war if the terms of the negotiation do not provide Ukraine with enough reassurance and security about the future. So that is the main concern. So, when I watched the Oval Office fiasco like everybody else, on one level, on a human level, I felt sad, frankly. Sad to watch, a U.S. partner like President Zelensky, who is under incredible pressure. I mean, existential pressure. For us, this is a war that is about strategy and about principle and about what is right in the world. And yes, our interests are directly implicated because those things matter to the United States and should matter to the United States. For the Ukrainians, it's about the existence of their country. To watch him be berated by the president, by the vice president, was just a very hard thing, I think, for those of us who had worked with the Ukrainians over a number of years to watch on a basic human level. But as important as that, I just think it was bad strategy, inconsistent with American interests. I think we are, frankly, really invested in trying to get a good outcome here, in part also because Russia, as the perpetrator, if they are allowed to benefit from what they've done. Okay, if the lesson the world draws is, yeah, the world resisted Russia for a while, but ultimately they prevailed, they succeeded, they achieved what they had set out to do. That is a terrible lesson, not just for Russia in the future, but for other countries that could potentially be perpetrators in the future. If the lesson is instead that Russia tried to do something it never should have tried to do, it paid an enormous cost for that. And by the way, up till now, it has paid an enormous cost. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded Russians in this conflict. And I should say, as much as the United States and our allies have supported Ukraine, no U.S. casualties in this conflict, other than there have been some Americans who, and we've discouraged this, went and actually fought in Ukraine, but no U.S. official casualties, no Army casualties, no civilian casualties among Americans who were supporting. And the same is true for our allies. And that is, actually something that is a big problem for Russia, much less of a big problem for the West.
So what do you think is the president's infatuation or sympathy for Russia and Putin? It obviously is a very dramatic difference than what President Biden's opinion of Putin was. Where do you think that comes from?
I mean, there's obviously a lot of speculation about this. The honest answer is I do not know. I do not know. I do think we have an administration that rather than standing against this idea that might makes right in the world, they actually both believe it is an accurate way to describe how the world works and kind of seem to believe that it's how the world should work too. And so when they see actors who they perceive as strong and decisive, almost whether or not they are aligned with how we see the world or our values, they are kind of drawn to that, or President Trump at least seems to be drawn to that. And what's interesting about his desire to end the war is, yes, on some level, he seems to want to end the war because he thinks it would be good if the fighting stopped. But when he's describing why he wants to end the war, he also often says, I think it would help us have a better relationship with Russia. Now, why he is so concerned with having a better relationship with Russia, I don't know. Sure, it's good on some level for the U.S. to have a good relationship with any country, even countries that are adversarial to us, better than being at war. Nobody wants a war with Russia. President Biden actively talked about how one goal we had was not to actually engage in direct conflict with Russia, but to put such a high premium, such a high priority on having a better relationship with a country that is not that significant economically, that is governed in a horrific authoritarian way, and that behaves as recklessly and dangerously in the world as Russia does, is not something I can explain.